Welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, July 28th, 2024. Happy 100 days till Election Day. I'll be releasing an election prediction later today, so I encourage you to make sure that you watch that. Really excited to release it. It's my first ever prediction since Joe Biden has exited the race here. But what we're mostly focused on in this video is a favorability rating poll that we've seen from ABC News and Ipsos, showing Kamala Harris as the only major candidate nationwide, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, RFK Jr. included, the only major candidate nationwide who now has a net positive on overall favorability. This comes at a time that Kamala Harris has a completely new image in the eyes of the American public. 1 week ago, less than a week ago actually, Kamala Harris was only the vice presidential candidate and Joe Biden was the presidential nominee, de facto at least, was going to win the nomination at the convention, the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. And so 6 days and 22 hours ago, Joe Biden made the announcement that he would be departing from the race and Kamala Harris would be who he endorses for the nomination. And since then, we have seen massive enthusiasm and engagement around the vice president, raising over $200 million, securing all the delegates needed to win the nomination in just under 48 hours, and overall having far more signups for the campaign than the Biden campaign had ever seen from the duration of its announcement to the dropping out of Joe Biden. But I think what we find to be most interesting in this new poll is Kamala Harris's favorability rating in comparison to other mainstream candidates. Kamala Harris, who has long been foreseen as this Democrat who many people believed had no chance at electoral victory in 2024. Many people wrote off and believed that Kamala Harris, because of her unfavorability rating nationwide, was just unelectable on the national level. But what we find is that when Americans are actually forced with the option of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, they find Kamala Harris to be far more favorable than they did just a week ago. What you can see on the Real Clear Politics average here is that Kamala Harris was in a pretty low point around the announcement of her, Joe Biden dropping out of the race. She was unfavorable, 52.3% nationwide. The majority of the American public said they had an unfavorable view of Kamala Harris, and just 38% of Americans had a favorable view of Kamala Harris. But take a look at this. This huge surge from 37% up to 42% nationwide means something. It shows that Kamala Harris is hitting all the points she needs to hit and shows that in just under a week, she can recover her image amongst 4 to 5% of America, and the unfavorability rating has dropped quite tremendously. This has brought it from being an overall net negative for Kamala Harris on the announcement of Joe Biden departing from the race, being down 15 points, to today only being down 8.6. It's the way that it goes in which an election can really change the way somebody is perceived nationwide, and often it is for the negative. But for Kamala Harris, it simply isn't that. Now, this brand new poll from ABC News and Ipsos is, in a way, an anomaly. But since the announcement, we have seen very few polls that have shown Kamala Harris really in the much more negative position that she was in just weeks prior. The worst poll that she's seen shows her down 14 points nationwide. But other than that, the most you would see is 10, 11. But in many cases, -6, -5, -4, -2, and now +1 for the first time in months. Kamala Harris comes into this race with a far better chance than Joe Biden for a number of different reasons. Now, with the new money and enthusiasm on her side, it's hard to see how this was ever a difficult choice. But at the time, it was very clear that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were performing roughly evenly. The favorability ratings were roughly the same. The overall average had Joe Biden down 15 points nationwide, Kamala Harris down 15 points as well. And so it was really hard to see how Kamala Harris could take on the helm and end up doing far better than Joe Biden. But we just have weirder things happening in American politics that really impact the way that people perceive an election and also perceive Kamala Harris. As the vice president, she was more on the back end. People didn't see her as much. She wasn't the one headlining the major events. She wasn't the main one campaigning for the campaign. Obviously, that was the candidate and everything was about the candidate. The VP debate didn't come before the presidential debate. The presidential debate was what made all of this happen. And so Kamala Harris now has been given a brand new opportunity to change her perception amongst the American public. And I will say this, looking at some of these numbers, I think the Democratic Party should be quite hopeful. Now, never in any circumstance should either party be complacent. But I think the Republican Party seriously screwed up in choosing J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee. I made a video yesterday talking about how J.D. Vance broke polling records, but in a very, very bad way, being the lowest approval rating for a vice presidential pick in decades, the lowest we have ever seen for a vice presidential nominee in the 21st century, even lower than Sarah Palin, even lower than Tim Kaine, and arguably, they actually had quite high approval ratings coming into the race. Almost every single person in the past 40 years without fail has come in with a net positive. J.D. Vance is the only one who comes in with a net negative. That matters because J.D. Vance was supposed to shake up the race in a way that Democrats, in theory, were unable to with President Biden and Vice President Harris. That is no longer the case. And with J.D. Vance's dwindling approval rating and Kamala Harris doing very well, especially amongst independents, I want us to take a closer look at this. So, understanding Kamala Harris's numbers here, she's only up 1 point nationwide. But that matters because ABC News and Ipsos actually did a poll a week ago that showed Kamala Harris had a 35% favorability rating. Today, it's 43%. So in just under a week, she has gained 8 points nationwide on overall net approval. Not net approval, overall approval. The unfavorability rating went from 46% a week ago down to 42%, which means 4% of the nation that used to have an unfavorable view 7 days ago now has a favorable view of Kamala Harris. And just 35%, roughly a third of this nation, it's getting far closer to a half. That matters, and that's significant. But the other point that is interesting too is that since the announcement of Kamala Harris's campaign, and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are no longer juxtaposed with President Biden and Vice President Harris, their approval ratings have taken a dip as well. Amongst independents, Kamala Harris went from 28% a week ago to now 44% favorability rating, 28 to 44. Talk about an electorate that matters because I'm telling you this, Republicans didn't like Kamala Harris more since a week ago. Democrats already liked Kamala Harris. It is these independent voters that make up a fraction of the electorate, but obviously sway the race, that went from 28% to 44%, a 16-point gain in approval. It's hard to see how anyone sees this as a massive, massive gain. The unfavorability rating, which in comparison is a slight drop, but genuinely I think this might be underselling it by a lot, went from 47%, nearly half the nation, half of independents across the country had an unfavorability rating of Kamala Harris. Today, it is just 40%. What does this mean? From 47 to 28 in the negative, a 19-point delta net negative has now translated into a 4-point positive. Do you know what that means? It's a 23-point swing amongst independents in 7 days, in 5 business days. I mean, this is incomprehensible, but just goes to show that 100 days out from the election, Kamala Harris was by far, the better choice for president, and by far has been winning this campaign thus far. Has been taking the very, very, very bare bones little what she had. I mean, she came into this with minutes before the announcement was made to the public. We saw very, very, very little preparation for this on the campaign front, on the administrative front, and yet Democrats have turned this into a full-force $200 million fundraising campaign. Across super PACs, $350 million plus in the past 7 days. And the approval rating is really doing well. And I know I got past that point talking about how juxtaposition is a very big thing in this election because it's all about comparison. At least it was all about comparison. It was Joe Biden was the lesser of two evils. That is what the Democratic Party's strategy and campaign was. But now it's for someone. Now it's for Kamala Harris. And in terms of Donald Trump's approval rating, we talked about this. The way that people perceive him was largely indicative of how they saw Joe Biden. If they didn't like him, they probably liked him. Vice versa. Trump's favorability rating amongst independents saw a drop since last week. And keep in mind, this is since the RNC, which took place last weekend. Crazy, right? In a week, 7 days, Joe Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris is taking the helm. I mean, I want you to genuinely reflect on this. It was a month and a day ago that the presidential debate happened. A month and a day ago, Joe Biden and Donald Trump faced off in Atlanta, Georgia on CNN. It is crazy the amount that has happened since then. An assassination attempt on a former president. An announcement of a new vice presidential contender. An entire Republican National Convention. And the dropping out of the president of the United States in a presidential race with less than 110 days until Election Day. So much has happened. But a lot of it should have favored Donald Trump. The assassination attempt, we've talked about this. That was meant to be a rallying call for the nation. And historically, it has been. But not in this election. Choosing a new vice presidential candidate was supposed to boost Donald Trump, speak to his intellect, speak to his ability to choose someone that Americans want. Didn't happen. 4 days of nonstop coverage of Donald Trump's Republican National Convention. Speech after speech after speech. Donald Trump is a good man. Donald Trump should be our next president. Joe Biden has to go. Donald Trump is X, Y, and Z. And then the incumbent president drops out of the race because in the first presidential debate, He lost the debate to Donald Trump. And yet with all of it, his overall approval rating has actually taken a drop. 27% of independents have a favorable view of Trump, down from 35% last week. You know what this means? That 35% was higher than where Kamala Harris was a week ago. Think about that for a moment. Kamala Harris had a lower approval amongst independents a week ago, and now Donald Trump is down to 27% and she is up to 44%. 44%. And also, this whole idea of double haters, people who hate both sides, Biden and Trump, that was 15% of America. Today, that has been cut to just 7%, and that matters. That matters. And so Democrats are coming into this with an approval rating for someone who at first never seemed like they were even going to be viable on the national level. But this massive, massive shift, I mean, just take a look at this. This is insanity. This is as if something major happened, right? Right? If Kamala Harris, if we were being invaded by aliens and Kamala Harris was there and put a complete stop to it, that is what you would see, approvals shooting up like this. And I can tell you now, it is only going to continue. Because this is exactly what happened back in 2020 with President Joe Biden. His approval rating today, negative 15.5%. In the ABC News Ipsos poll, negative 13%. But in terms of where we were back in 2020, I've narrowed down this graph to the beginning of January. January 1st, 2020, roughly, 1st or 2nd. I guess I was off by a day. The unfavorability rating for President Biden, 3.7% more nationwide than favorable, right? People didn't like Biden on the overall net. At some points in time, he almost neared 50% on approval. At that time, you might be thinking, wow, I guess Joe Biden really wasn't on track to win the election back then. But then he started to do well in the nomination, started to do well nationwide, and then he won the nomination, essentially. This is around the time that Bernie Sanders dropped out of the presidential race. Overall net negative of 1 point. So Democrats realized they needed to do something. Donald Trump's attacks became more and more real. 6 points nationwide. Democrats needed to turn it around. So what did they do? They campaigned on character. They spent the coming months to spend all their time on advertisements about Joe Biden's story, how he is a good man, how he has a story that Americans should be proud of and should vote for in this election. And it genuinely worked. It gave Americans a new view of someone that they had seen in the White House for 8 years, who had been on the back burner of President Obama for all intents and purposes. And that's not a knock at President Biden. That is exactly how people perceive the role of the vice president, that you're the yes man, the right-hand man to the president of the United States. And so for all of their negatives are all of your negatives until you build your own brand. And that's what Joe Biden was able to do. Favorability started to get closer and closer and then started to get positive. A dip for a little, but then came the convention. Around this point, the nonstop media coverage around Joe Biden's story, his character, his relationship with his family, his relationship to God, his country, his Senate serve. You have so many different things that the Democratic Party realized if we don't win the game on favorability rating, if we don't win the game on who likes us more, we lose this election. And so what did they do? They took all of these negative qualities and steamrolled them out. And it began to make Joe Biden much more positive in terms of overall approval. And guess what? By the time we reached Election Day, 6% more of the nation and the majority of the nation viewed Joe Biden more favorably than unfavorably. That was a 9-point swing in the span of a year. For Kamala Harris, it has been nearly a 9-point swing in the span of a week. That matters. That makes a huge impact. And I will have to say, too, when you take a look at Kamala Harris's approval rating before she was the vice presidential nominee, it actually wasn't quite high. You can see that they have some polls in the earlier stages, but what you find is that when she was running for president, when she was running for president as the Democratic nominee, it was all negatives. These are the numbers, all negatives, right? And then after she was chosen as the VP nom, all of a sudden the Democratic Party, again, on her story, on who she is as a person, became positive. This is what Democrats are going to do. And then obviously, as the term went on, it was positive in the beginning, the honeymoon period that we had, but then it became negative and negative and negative. So now Democrats need to go ahead. I mean, I'm telling you, you could not find a positive poll in months on end until today, until she has been given the opportunity to lead a national campaign. And now Kamala Harris is doing far better than people had predicted when she was in the running for consideration. And guess what? She has more things coming her way. All of those positives for Donald Trump that should have been positives ended up being negatives. And now Kamala Harris has the opportunity to do what is right for her campaign, and that is choose a strong running mate, which she will do, have a strong convention, which we know she will do, and have a strong debate performance, which in comparison to President Biden anything will be an upgrade. I'm telling you this. That's how this campaign is going to be looked at. Is Kamala Harris better fit than President Biden was? And I can guarantee you, in the way that she does her debate styles, she will do very well against President Trump. And we know this. And Donald Trump's campaign knows this too. That's why they backed out of the VP debates when they chose J.D. Vance. That's why they're backing out of the presidential debates, because Democrats are choosing Kamala Harris. Because they know the momentum is now completely flipped. What was months on end of a constant Trump lead nationwide has now translated into Trump's lead diminishing, Kamala Harris's approval rating increasing, and overall negative factors impacting the Republican Party at large. Kamala Harris's new numbers show that she can do exactly what is necessary to win, and that is become popular and win this election. She just needed the platform to do it. And we are seeing in full force in just 7 days how much a very strong Democratic contender can do for themselves, do for the party, and in terms of electability, do what they can to win this election. Because things looked very grim 7 days ago today. But they no longer do for Democrats, and I think they're very excited to see that Kamala Harris, in new numbers for the first time in 3 years, I kid you not, a positive poll for her nationwide. The first time in 3 years. This must feel good for Democrats, and I think you can entirely understand why Kamala Harris very much on track to win the presidency. If she maintains this rate, this constant upward trend, Democrats have their pathway forward. The question is, will they take it and will they do well with it over the next 100 days? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist from my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.